The nameless of the Astral Express are often portrayed as a group of carefree adventurers, traveling the cosmos, helping the downtrodden, and pushing the boundaries of known space. They often visit other planets or star systems and would go out of their way to help those in need. Because practically anyone can choose to join them on their journey, it's often thought that the nameless do not have any well-defined structure amongst their members, and in some regards, this is true. There are, however, roles that exist within the hierarchy of the nameless that relate to the functioning of their group and the Express. You have mechanics who maintain the Astral Express itself, guards who protect both its members and the train, and even surveyors and archivists who collect and catalog the information they find on their journeys. In this video though, we are going to talk about one of the more important roles, that of the Navigator. What exactly do they do? Who are the past known navigators? And what does it take to become one? Before we explore that in more detail, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. The Navigators of the Astral Express serve as one of its most important roles. They are the ones who chart the course between one location and the next, maintain the star maps, and even act as the de facto leaders of the Nameless. But most importantly, they are responsible for ensuring that the chosen path of travel is safe. The empty voids of the Star Rail universe is one fraught with many dangers and uncertainties. A wrong turn may cause you to be eaten by a planet-sized bug from the swarm, or perhaps enter within the range of IX's sphere of nihilistic influence. As such, a navigator functions as a bulwark against these threats, and through skilled maneuvering, careful planning, and forward thinking, they can ensure the journey is as uneventful as possible. They kind of remind me of navigators in other popular media, like those of the Spacing Guild in Dune, who use spice and prescience to enable safe space travel, or the navigators of the Imperium from Warhammer, who help navigate ships through the ever-changing warp. Now, given the Astral Express started its journey with the aeon of trailblazing themselves, it's very likely that in the early days, Akivili was the one who fulfilled this role. I'm not entirely sure if they held this role all the way to their supposed death, but based on the profiles of some of the past navigators, this doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, I'm pretty sure the minute a few people started following them, Akivili just pushed the responsibility to the Nameless so that they themselves could just have fun traveling. So how do these navigators actually determine the safest path? According to the databank, while Akivili was still around, the Astral Express traveled using the Astral Rail, or referred to as the Silver Rail, a connection point between space that is powered by the path of the Trailblaze. It's likely that whenever the Express goes from one point to another, using the path of the Trailblaze, they can then connect both these locations. It's kind of like leaving breadcrumbs you can retrace your steps with, only on a cosmic scale. So whenever they are traveling, utilizing these pre-established cosmic rails are likely the safest approach, as each navigator would know where each endpoint is, allowing them to adjust accordingly to avoid hazards or potential dangers. This means that if the Nameless were to travel to a previously visited location, the journey is far safer due to the presence of these rails. On the other hand, if they were to go into uncharted territories where no rail points exist, it's likely far more dangerous of a journey, and they would need to rely more on the abilities of the navigator and the conductor to stay safe. But this isn't always the case though. Just to paint a picture, in the current setting, Himeko has only ever used the pre-established rail points, and the Nameless still meet all sorts of obstacles from Stelerons to giant bugs. As you already know, these rails actually benefit many other factions as well, since practically anybody can use them as methods of safe travel. The law even states that the Xianzhou Alliance and the IPC both use these paths, and even credit Akivili and the Nameless as the first to connect a majority of the universe. So suffice to say, the navigators of the Astral Express actually play a pretty important role in helping the Nameless circumnavigate the dangers of the cosmos. Now, up till this point, we haven't really learned much about the Nameless and their past, but thanks to the Cosmodesy event, we actually have quite a bit of exposition on some of its past navigators. I'm going to cover most of them here, but just know that there's quite a few to go through, and I might not detail their entire life story just to keep this concise. Also, each navigator we learn about during the event actually gives us some insight into the history of the nameless, and as we go through each navigator, you will actually see the troubles each era faced. But anyways, let's talk about the navigators now. The first navigator we'll talk about is Sam 3000, an Intellitron that was known as the Guide. It's very likely that Sam 3000 was one of the oldest and earliest navigators of the Nameless, as she was around during the time the Express was not a single train, but an entire fleet. She was said to be forthright and had a competitive spirit, often challenging anyone and anything to an arm wrestling competition. During her time, the Astral Express often ventured into unknown space, and this in itself is an indication of how long ago she was around. In fact, not only was she around when Akivili still roamed the universe, but the Nameless of her era actually witnessed the birth of the Aeon Mythos within Fuli's Eden of Blessed Insight. Being mostly machine though, her parts would eventually age and become less efficient, and she would eventually step down and pass the reins on to the next generation. The next navigator on this list is the capybara known as Three-Eyed, Capybaba. Yes, that's right. A capybara was a navigator, and the best thing about this is that they were one hell of an accomplished navigator. Now, Cappy is a rather unique navigator because firstly, it couldn't normally speak to the other nameless because, well, it was literally a capybara. Cappy had a handler who would interpret its language, and before the creation of the synesthesia beacons, universal translators, many assume it was just some random guy's pet aboard the Express. In truth, however, Cappy was one of the most experienced and knowledgeable of all the Astral Express's navigators. Cappy was good at its job because it had an unexplained but precise predictive ability, allowing it to see dangers light years away and deftly navigating the Express into safer routes. This was an extremely important ability given Cappy was a navigator during the time the Swarm had a notable presence within the universe. The references to the synesthesia beacon and the Swarm also hints at how long ago Cappy was a navigator, and despite not being as old as Sam 3000, Cappy was likely around when Akivili was still alive as well. Capibaba's contribution can even be felt to this very day, as it was the one to revise and improve on the Star Rail map, which is used even by Himeko. When it inevitably got older, as all mortals do, it eventually retired and stepped down, returning to its home planet in peace. The next navigator on our list is Dolly, also known as Crystal, who was a talented musician that joined the Nameless after hearing of Akivili's exploits. Dolly is the third navigator on this list and operated during a time when Akivili was still around. In fact, one of the reasons she even met the Aeon was due to her reputation and ability as a talented musician. She was so well known that even Akivili and Aeon would often return to the Express just to listen to one of her performances, or at least that's how the story goes. She was said to be very emotional and empathetic, though not much else is known about her. When Akivili fell, much like the other Nameless, she felt the fall of their beloved Aeon and began to mysteriously crystallize, perhaps out of grief. I'm not sure what exactly this implies and whether she met her demise this way, but it ultimately caused her to step down from her position as a navigator. Following Dolly's resignation, the Sentinel of Time, IC, I think that's how you say his name, who to me personally is one of the more interesting navigators on this list, took on the position. Before I continue with IC's lore, it's important to know that out of all the navigators we'll be talking about, IC is the only person who has had information about them obscured and tampered with by none other than the history fictionologists. So whatever info we have is likely difficult to trust entirely, but I'll still share them here anyways. IC became the Astral Express's navigator during a tumultuous time in their existence. Akivili had supposedly just died, and Nanook was on the verge of ascending. On top of that, due to the death of Akivili, there was rampant infighting among the followers of the Trailblaze due to each splintered sub-faction claiming they bore the true will of their now dead god. Despite all this, IC continued to be steadfast in his duties, and his dedication ensured that the Nameless would still survive to some degree to this very day. He would eventually resign from the position, though why exactly we don't really know, and he was said to have embraced finality. He He was even claimed to have had a hand in founding the Omen Vanguards, a faction that follows the Aeon of Finality. Now, whether IC knew something we all didn't, hint hint Akivili's terminus, or all of this is just made up, we don't really know because, as I've mentioned, most of his backstory was altered by the history fictionologists. Every lie though has a kernel of truth embedded in it, and perhaps some part of this story is true and IC might be someone we will run into in the near future. Following from IC's departure, his successor would be the Navigator affectionately known as the Morning Star, Falcon Amundsen. While IC had to navigate the difficulties of Akivili's death and Nanook's ascension, Falcon rose to his position at a time when the Stellarons were beginning to populate the universe. When IC had left, the Nameless were a shell of their former selves. Few remained on the Express and many had splintered off into sub-factions and were still fighting amongst themselves. For all intents and purposes, the Nameless were on the verge of dying off into obscurity. It was Falcon, through his leadership, that brought the Nameless back from the brink. As Falcon traveled through the cosmos, he helped and inspired many across the stars. This single-handedly kicked off the heroic era of the Trailblazers and shaped the positive impression many had of them that lingers to this very day. It is because of his exploits that today people view the Nameless as heroes, and to many he had saved and inspired, Falcon appeared as a guiding light and why he got the nickname Morning Star. The hat and timepiece that were handed down to the main character from Mikhail Legwork actually once belonged to the Morning Star himself. While his time was short, Falcon is one of the reasons why the Nameless's legacy has not completely disappeared. The next Navigator we have is Bob, or going by his nickname, Tusslehead. Up till this point in the video, there have been many notable Navigators, each of whom has left their mark on the universe. Bob is not one of them. Now, it's not to say that Bob was unremarkable or anything. He was once part of a crime syndicate wanted by the IPC and joined the Astral Express as a way to hide, kinda like a certain Dan Heng. While he didn't do anything of note, Bob created a stable enough atmosphere for the many that would join the Nameless, and each that came with unanswered questions, whether about their lives or future, eventually left having resolved them. Perhaps during a time where the universe was incredibly unstable and the Nameless just came back from the brink of extinction, stability is actually something you would want. He had ensured that the Nameless would continue existing and that the hard work Falcon had put in was not in vain. Not much else is known about Bob, so much like his rather short section here, let's move on to the Navigator who holds the record for being the shortest lived Navigator of the Nameless, Oakley. If you knew nothing else about Oakley, I'm sure you would instantly recognize her attire, which is the Musketeer's relic set. Without getting too much into the details, Oakley was taught how to be a sharpshooter by her father, and she had a genuine talent for it. One day, a bounty hunter challenged her father to a duel to the death, and unfortunately, her father lost. This kicked off Oakley's pursuit for revenge, as she wanted nothing more than to avenge her father. She became an IPC bounty hunter, hoping that by building a strong enough reputation, the one who had killed her father would eventually reveal themselves to her, wanting to challenge her much like they did to her father all those years ago. Her journey eventually brought her onto the Astral Express. At the time, she had no interest in joining them and only really traveled with them out of convenience. Unfortunately, on one of these travels, the Astral Express encountered an anomaly in space, and most of the passengers had mysteriously disappeared, save for herself and a handful of other passengers. Due to the desperate situation, the conductor at the time had asked Oakley to temporarily take on the role of the Navigator while they sorted things out. She took up the role and not only defended the Express from many star beasts, but also helped them in finding their lost comrades. Eventually, when everything settled down, she relinquished the position after being Navigator for a total of 6 months and 2 days and left the Astral Express to continue on with her journey. It's unclear whether she ever found a bounty hunter or if she met her demise in some other way, but her short tenure as a Navigator was undoubtedly one filled with plenty of adventure. Now, the last two Navigators are those that we are quite familiar with because of the main story and Penacony. The first is Granholm, who we heard quite a bit about during the 2.2 story, and the second is the current Navigator of the Express, Himeko. I won't really cover their story here as we already learnt a bit about Granholm in Penacony, while Himeko likely deserves a video all her own once we learn more about her past. So with that, you now know a bit about each of the navigators of the Astral Express, their exploits, and their contributions. I'm sure that this list doesn't even begin to scratch the surface, and there were likely many more navigators we just haven't heard of yet. The navigators are without a doubt central to the nameless, as they functionally act as the de facto leader of the group, guiding them through the stars and ensuring each nameless reaches their destination safely. It seems that the title of navigator is really only given to those who display traits of leadership, and why I happen to believe that by the end of the story, perhaps the mantle of navigator will fall upon the shoulders of the main character. Though if that comes at the death of Himeko or something, we don't know yet. But to avoid dragging this out further, I'll end the video here. Who was your favorite among these navigators, and which one of them do you think was the most impactful? Share your thoughts in the comments below. When I did the personality test, I personally got Falcon Amundsen. If the video was entertaining, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.